September 1529. Before sunrise, Vienna was quiet. Rainwater dripped from rooftops. Mud clung to boots. The air carried the smell of damp earth and wet timber from hastily repaired defenses. Along the city's walls, watchmen peered into darkness beyond the fields. They had spent days hearing rumors. Villages burned to the east. Refugees arrived with stories that seemed impossible. Entire regions of Hungary had been crossed by an army so large that some witnesses claimed it stretched beyond sight. Now those rumors were becoming visible. As dawn slowly pushed through the clouds, shapes began to emerge from the mist. At first they appeared as scattered shadows across the countryside. Then more appeared, and more. Soon the hills and open ground beyond Vienna seemed covered with movement. Cavalry patrols rode ahead of the main force. Banners fluttered in the morning wind. Columns of men marched through mud-darkened fields. Camp followers, wagons, animals, engineers, laborers, and soldiers continued arriving hour after hour. The Ottoman army had reached Vienna. Inside the city, few people knew exactly how many enemies stood outside their walls. Contemporary estimates would vary wildly. Some claimed over 100,000 men. Others insisted there were far more. Centuries later, historians would continue debating the exact number. But from the perspective of those standing on Vienna's walls, the arithmetic hardly mattered. The army before them looked endless. The Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power. Its ruler, Sultan Suleiman, had spent years expanding one of the strongest states in the world. He had defeated armies, captured cities, and shattered kingdoms. Just 3 years earlier, the Kingdom of Hungary had suffered a devastating defeat at Mohács. Now, the same empire that had broken Hungary stood before Vienna. And yet, the greatest threat facing Suleiman's army was not hidden behind the city's walls. It was hidden in the road behind him. The First Siege of Vienna was not decided by numbers alone. It became a contest between imperial ambition and logistical reality, where weather, distance, time, and determined defenders proved as dangerous as any army. The men defending Vienna could see only part of the danger surrounding them. What they could not see was the long chain of decisions, political rivalries, and mounting problems that had brought the Ottoman army here in the first place. If the most powerful ruler in Europe had arrived with one of the largest armies of the 16th century, what could possibly stop him from taking the city? The answer would emerge slowly, one decision at a time. To understand why Vienna found itself facing what seemed like impossible odds in the autumn of 1529, we need to go back 3 years, to a battlefield that changed the balance of power in Central Europe. In August 1526, the Kingdom of Hungary suffered a disaster. The Battle of Mohács lasted only a few hours, but its consequences would echo for generations. Hungarian forces met Suleiman's army in southern Hungary and were overwhelmed. Thousands died. The Hungarian army collapsed. Most importantly, King Louis II was killed while attempting to escape the battlefield. His death created a crisis that no military victory alone could solve. A king could be replaced. A kingdom could survive defeat. But Hungary now faced a far more dangerous problem. It lacked a clear and universally accepted successor. Almost immediately, rival claims emerged. One claimant was Ferdinand of Habsburg, Archduke of Austria, and brother of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Ferdinand, believed he possessed a legitimate claim through dynastic agreements and family connections. He also understood that Hungary represented far more than additional territory. Whoever controlled Hungary controlled the frontier between Central Europe and the expanding Ottoman Empire. The other major claimant was John Zápolya, one of Hungary's most powerful nobles. Zápolya enjoyed substantial support among Hungarian elites who preferred a native ruler rather than a foreign Habsburg prince. He viewed himself as the rightful king and had no intention of surrendering his claim. Suddenly Hungary became more than a kingdom. It became a prize. Ferdinand and Zápolya both wanted the Hungarian crown. Neither possessed enough strength to secure it without outside support. And that reality created an opportunity for Suleiman. From Constantinople, the Ottoman ruler watched events unfold. Suleiman had already achieved extraordinary success. Belgrade had fallen. Rhodes had fallen. Mohacs had destroyed Hungary's army. Ottoman influence now extended deep into southeastern Europe. Yet military victories created new responsibilities. Conquered territory needed protection. Allied rulers needed support. Rivals needed to be discouraged from challenging Ottoman authority. Hungary sat directly between the Ottoman Empire and Habsburg Austria. Leaving the region unstable carried serious risks. If Ferdinand gained complete control over Hungary, the Habsburg frontier would move closer to Ottoman lands. If Zapolia survived with Ottoman backing, Hungary could serve as a buffer separating the two great powers. The question was no longer whether Suleiman would involve himself in Hungarian affairs. The question was how far he would go. As the political struggle intensified, Ferdinand attempted to strengthen his position through military action. Habsburg forces moved into Hungary. Cities changed hands. Alliances shifted. Claims and counterclaims multiplied. What began as a succession dispute gradually evolved into a larger contest between dynasties and empires. For ordinary people living in Hungary, the distinction mattered little. Armies marched through their lands. Taxes increased. Fortresses became targets. Entire communities found themselves trapped between competing rulers. Meanwhile, John Zapolia searched for a powerful protector. He found one in Suleiman. The alliance made strategic sense for both men. Zapolia gained support from the strongest military power in the region. Suleiman gained influence over Hungary without necessarily having to govern every corner of it directly. Together they presented a challenge Ferdinand could not ignore. By 1529, the situation had reached a breaking point. Suleiman decided to intervene personally. The decision reflected confidence, but it was not reckless confidence. From his perspective, the campaign appeared entirely reasonable. Ottoman armies had repeatedly demonstrated their effectiveness. The Habsburg position in Hungary remained uncertain. Supporting Zapolia offered both political and military advantages. The campaign also promised an opportunity to demonstrate Ottoman power before allies and enemies alike. Yet every ambitious campaign contains hidden risks. The farther an army marches from its base of operations, the more difficult every problem becomes. Food becomes harder to transport. Horses require more forage. Roads deteriorate. Rivers flood. Equipment breaks. Communication slows. Small difficulties accumulate until they become serious obstacles. In the spring of 1529, many of those dangers still seemed distant. What mattered was momentum. Suleiman assembled a massive army and prepared to march northward. The campaign's immediate objective centered on restoring Ottoman influence in Hungary and strengthening Zapolia's position. But as preparations advanced, larger possibilities began to emerge. Vienna stood beyond Hungary. Vienna was Ferdinand's capital. Vienna represented the heart of Habsburg Austria. Its political importance far exceeded its size. Capturing the city would not automatically destroy Habsburg power, but it would send a powerful message throughout Europe. Allies would question Habsburg's strength. Rivals would take notice. Ottoman prestige would rise even higher. For Ferdinand, the stakes were equally clear. If Vienna fell, Austria itself would be exposed. If Vienna survived, the Habsburgs could continue resisting Ottoman expansion. What had begun as a dispute over Hungary was becoming something much larger. The struggle now involved two expanding powers, attempting to shape the future of Central Europe. As spring turned into summer, preparations accelerated. Orders were issued. Supplies were gathered. Troops assembled from across the Ottoman world. Far to the west, Vienna watched and waited. The people living behind its walls could not know exactly when the storm would arrive. They only knew that it was coming. And with every passing week, the army marching toward them grew closer. In May 1529, Suleiman's army began moving north. At first, the campaign unfolded much as Ottoman commanders expected. The empire possessed one of the most sophisticated military systems in the world. Its armies had crossed vast distances before. Its officers understood logistics. Its engineers could bridge rivers, build roads, and move artillery across difficult terrain. There was every reason to believe that another successful campaign lay ahead. Then the weather intervened. Heavy rains swept across much of the route. Roads turned into mud. Fields became waterlogged. Rivers swelled. Wagons sank. Draft animals struggled. Every mile demanded more time and effort than expected. The problem was not a single storm, it was persistence. Day after day, the army fought the landscape itself. As the columns advanced through the Balkans and into Hungary, reports began reaching commanders about animals dying from exhaustion. Supply trains lagged behind schedule. Equipment became harder to move. Wheels broke. Horses weakened. The campaign continued forward, but it was no longer moving efficiently. Suleiman now faced an important decision: delay the campaign and risk losing momentum, or continue despite the growing difficulties. Neither option was ideal. A delay would consume precious campaigning season. Every week lost during summer would matter once autumn arrived. The farther north the army marched, the more dangerous winter would become. Suleiman chose to continue. The decision made sense. The army remained powerful. Morale remained strong. No enemy force appeared capable of stopping the advance in open battle. Temporary logistical difficulties seemed manageable, but every decision creates new consequences. By choosing speed over caution, the Ottoman army preserved momentum. At the same time, it increased the strain on men, animals, and equipment. One problem proved particularly important: heavy siege artillery. The largest guns in the Ottoman arsenal could destroy fortifications that smaller weapons struggled to breach. These massive cannon had played important roles in previous campaigns, but they were also extremely difficult to transport under ideal conditions. The roads of 1529 were far from ideal. Mud swallowed wheels. Animals collapsed under the strain. Some heavy equipment fell behind. Other pieces became nearly impossible to move efficiently. As the army advanced, commanders increasingly faced a reality they could not fully solve. They were approaching one of the most important cities in Central Europe, without all the tools normally used to reduce such a target. Meanwhile, events unfolded very differently inside Vienna. Count Niklas Salm understood the situation facing the city. He was not a young commander chasing glory. He was an experienced veteran who had spent decades in warfare. He recognized that Vienna could not hope to match Ottoman strength in the field. The city's survival depended on preparation. Workers strengthened defenses. Walls received repairs. Weak points were reinforced. Ditches were improved. Buildings near vulnerable areas were cleared when necessary. Every available resource became valuable. Soldiers drilled. Weapons were distributed. Powder and ammunition were organized. Civilians assisted wherever possible. The atmosphere inside Vienna differed sharply from the confidence often associated with military campaigns. Few defenders expected an easy victory. Many simply hoped to survive. The garrison itself reflected the diverse military world of 16th-century Europe. Professional soldiers stood alongside local defenders. German Landsknechts prepared to fight with pikes and firearms. Mercenaries joined city troops. Armed citizens prepared to defend their homes. The force was not large. Compared to the army approaching Vienna, it appeared hopelessly outnumbered. Yet numbers alone do not determine outcomes. The defenders possessed advantages of their own. They knew the terrain. They fought behind fortifications. They needed only to hold. The attackers needed to break them. As summer passed and autumn approached, the campaign entered a more dangerous phase. The Ottoman army regained control of Buda and strengthened John Zapolya's position. In one sense, the campaign was already achieving important political objectives. Yet Suleiman continued west. That decision transformed the entire expedition. Marching toward Vienna meant accepting additional risks, more distance, more strain, more dependence on supplies, more exposure to weather. The campaign had crossed a point where turning back would carry political costs. Advancing carried military risks. Retreating carried reputational risks. The deeper the army moved into Habsburg territory, the fewer easy choices remained. By September, Vienna stood directly ahead. The city could see the storm approaching. The army could finally see its objective. Neither side could easily step away. The siege was about to begin. In late September 1529, the Ottoman army arrived outside Vienna. The appearance alone created a powerful psychological effect. Campfires stretched across the landscape. Columns continued arriving throughout the day. The countryside filled with tents, wagons, cavalry, laborers, engineers, and soldiers. From the walls, defenders could watch an entire military world assembling around them. Vienna was surrounded. As was common in siege warfare, demands for surrender were presented. The defenders refused. That decision immediately clarified the situation. No negotiation would end the crisis. The city would stand or fall through force. Once formal siege operations began, Ottoman commanders quickly encountered a serious obstacle. The city's defenses remained stronger than expected. More importantly, the army lacked enough heavy artillery to rapidly demolish them. This was not a complete absence of guns. The Ottomans still possessed artillery, but the enormous siege cannon capable of creating devastating breaches had not arrived in sufficient numbers. The weather and roads had taken their toll. The consequence was significant. Instead of overwhelming Vienna quickly, the Ottomans would need patience. And patience favored the defenders. Recognizing this reality, Ottoman commanders shifted emphasis toward another method: mining. If artillery could not reliably destroy the walls, perhaps explosives beneath the walls could. Engineers and sappers began digging tunnels. Their objective was straightforward: reach positions beneath key sections of the fortifications, place charges, collapse walls from below, create openings for assault troops. The plan was sound. Ottoman military engineers possessed considerable experience, but successful mining required time, and time created opportunities for defenders. Inside Vienna, soldiers began hearing rumors. Then they began hearing sounds: knocking, scraping, distant vibrations beneath the earth. The siege expanded underground. Countermining operations soon became one of the most important parts of the defense. Listening posts were established. Men monitored the ground. When suspicious activity was detected, defenders dug their own tunnels. The resulting struggle was unlike conventional battle. In darkness beneath the city, opposing groups sometimes searched for one another through layers of soil and rock. A successful mine could destroy part of a wall. A successful countermine could save it. Neither side could afford mistakes. As days passed, the pressure intensified. Bombardments continued. Engineers worked. Defenders repaired damage. Every successful Ottoman action forced new defensive responses. Every successful defense required additional Ottoman effort. The siege became a contest of endurance. By early October, visible damage appeared along portions of the city's defenses. Walls cracked. Earthworks shifted. Breaches emerged in some locations. The situation inside Vienna grew increasingly tense. No one knew exactly where the next attack would come. A damaged section of wall could become the focus of a major assault. A successful mine could suddenly transform the battlefield. Defenders remained constantly alert. Ottoman commanders now faced another decision: continue gradual pressure or launch more aggressive attacks. They chose escalation. If the city was to fall before weather and logistics became overwhelming problems, decisive action would eventually be necessary. Assault forces moved forward. Janissaries prepared for combat. Elite infantry would play a central role in any breakthrough attempt. The fighting became increasingly violent. Under fire from defenders, Ottoman troops advanced toward damaged sections of the fortifications. Arquebuses cracked from the walls. Smoke drifted across the battlefield. Men carrying ladders and equipment attempted to close the distance. Every advance came at a cost. Every defensive success required effort from exhausted soldiers. Near midday, during several major engagements, the struggle concentrated around vulnerable points in the defenses. Pikemen stood ready behind breaches. Firearms crews targeted attackers. Close combat erupted whenever Ottoman troops reached favorable positions. The defenders did not need to destroy the attacking army. They simply needed to deny it access. That distinction mattered enormously. For the Ottomans, limited success was insufficient. For Vienna, survival itself represented success. Hours passed, then days. The weather continued worsening. Rain returned repeatedly. Mud deepened around siege works. Movement became harder. Supplies became more difficult to distribute. The same conditions that had damaged the campaign during the march now affected siege operations. The consequences accumulated. Powder became harder to protect. Equipment suffered. Animals weakened further. Men grew tired. The army remained dangerous. But maintaining pressure became increasingly difficult. Inside Vienna, conditions were hardly comfortable. Defenders faced their own crisis. Walls required constant repairs. Casualties mounted. Food concerns grew. Sleep became scarce. Every explosion raised fears that a major breach had finally appeared. Yet the defenders possessed one crucial advantage. They could see the attackers facing problems as well. The longer the siege continued, the more both sides began asking the same question. Which army would break first? The Ottomans still possessed superior numbers. The defenders still possessed walls. Neither advantage guaranteed victory. As October progressed, Suleiman confronted a narrowing window of opportunity. Autumn was advancing. Campaigning seasons were not endless. Every additional day increased the risks associated with remaining before Vienna. The army could not stay indefinitely. That reality encouraged a final effort. A major assault offered the possibility of ending the siege. Failure would force difficult choices. On October 14, the struggle reached its climax. Ottoman forces prepared for a concentrated attack against multiple sectors. Engineers had done what they could. Artillery had done what it could. Now infantry would determine the outcome. The attack began. Across damaged sections of the defenses, Ottoman troops surged forward. Combat erupted along the walls. Defenders rushed to threatened areas. Officers attempted to direct men toward the most dangerous points. For hours, confusion and violence dominated the battlefield. Reports moved slowly. Visibility was poor. No commander possessed a complete picture of events. What mattered was holding, or breaking, nothing in between. Again and again, Ottoman troops pressed attacks. Again and again, defenders responded. The struggle came down to small groups of men fighting over narrow sections of ground. A few yards gained could matter enormously. A few yards lost could become disastrous. Yet, despite intense pressure, the city held. Breaches failed to produce a decisive breakthrough. Defensive positions remained contested rather than captured. Momentum began slipping away from the attackers. That change did not happen instantly. There was no single dramatic moment when everyone realized the siege had failed. Instead, reality gradually became impossible to ignore. The city still stood. The walls still held. The defenders still resisted. And winter continued approaching. Suleiman now faced one final decision: continue the siege and risk greater losses, or withdraw. Neither option offered satisfaction, but one offered survival. The other offered uncertainty. Eventually, the choice became unavoidable. The siege would end. Vienna had not been conquered. The army that had crossed hundreds of miles to reach the city would have to leave. By the time the dust and smoke began to settle, one of the most ambitious campaigns of the 16th century had reached its conclusion. The defenders remained behind their walls. The Ottoman army prepared for the difficult journey home. When the Ottoman army began withdrawing from Vienna in mid-October 1529, The defenders did not immediately celebrate. Many were simply exhausted. For weeks, they had lived under constant pressure. They had listened for enemy miners beneath the ground. They had repaired walls under fire. They had rushed from one threatened position to another without knowing where the next attack might come. By the time the siege ended, relief mixed with disbelief. The city still stood. That fact alone felt remarkable. Outside the walls, the landscape revealed the cost of the struggle. Earthworks scarred the countryside. Collapsed tunnels marked the locations of failed mining operations. Abandoned equipment lay scattered across muddy ground. Damaged sections of wall showed where engineers and attackers had concentrated their efforts. Trenches cut through fields that only weeks earlier had been farmland. Smoke-blackened positions and shattered fortifications testified to the intensity of the fighting. For those who walked the defenses after the siege, the evidence of battle was everywhere. Yet understanding exactly how many lives had been lost is far more difficult. Like many 16th-century conflicts, casualty figures remain uncertain. Contemporary accounts often exaggerated losses, especially when describing enemies. Some reports reflected rumor rather than careful counting. Modern historians generally agree that the Ottomans suffered significant casualties during the siege and retreat, while Vienna's defenders also paid a substantial price. Exact numbers remain debated. What is beyond dispute is that neither side emerged untouched. The defenders had survived, but survival carried costs. Many soldiers were wounded. Supplies had been consumed. Sections of the city required repair. Families mourned lost relatives. The victory did not erase the hardships endured during the previous weeks. For the Ottoman army, the campaign's difficulties did not end when the siege ended. The retreat itself became another challenge. The same weather that had complicated the march toward Vienna continued creating problems on the journey back. Roads remained poor. Rain and mud persisted. Supplies remained a concern. Animals already weakened during the advance struggled under additional strain. An army withdrawing through worsening conditions often faces dangers very different from those encountered during battle. Exhaustion becomes a greater enemy. Discipline becomes harder to maintain. Logistical failures become more costly. The further the army moved from Vienna, the more obvious it became that the campaign had failed to achieve its most ambitious objective. The city had not fallen. That reality forced leaders on both sides to interpret events carefully. For Vienna and the Habsburgs, the siege represented a major defensive success. A city that many observers believed could not withstand the Ottoman Empire had survived. The defenders had faced one of the strongest military powers in the world and endured. For Suleiman, the situation appeared more complicated. The campaign had not been a complete disaster. Ottoman influence in Hungary remained strong. John Zapolya's position had been restored. The empire retained enormous military power. No rival army had defeated Suleiman in open battle. Yet Vienna remained unconquered. The distinction mattered. Military campaigns are often judged by their objectives. And the most famous objective of the 1529 campaign still stood behind repaired walls. Among the leaders most closely associated with Vienna's survival was Count Niklas Salm. His experience and leadership had helped coordinate the defense during the city's most dangerous moments. He survived the siege itself, but had suffered wounds during the fighting. Several months later, those injuries contributed to his death. Like many commanders throughout history, he lived long enough to see the outcome, but not long enough to enjoy it for many years. The siege was over, but its significance was only beginning to emerge. The First Siege of Vienna occupies an unusual place in history. It is often remembered as a dramatic victory for a smaller force against overwhelming odds. There is truth in that interpretation. A relatively small garrison had indeed resisted a much larger army. But reducing the siege to a simple story of courage overcoming numbers misses much of what actually happened. The defenders succeeded because courage was combined with preparation, leadership, fortifications, timing. and a series of problems that steadily weakened the attacking army. The campaign revealed something important about the limits of power. In 1529, the Ottoman Empire stood among the strongest states on earth. Its armies had conquered territories across 3 continents. Its administration functioned effectively. Its military institutions inspired both fear and respect. Yet even a powerful empire faced constraints. Distance mattered, roads mattered, weather mattered, supply systems mattered. The farther armies moved from their bases, the harder every task became. The siege demonstrated that military strength alone could not guarantee success if logistics failed to support strategy. For the Habsburgs, Vienna's survival carried enormous symbolic value. The city remained secure. Austria remained in the fight. The Habsburg position in Central Europe endured. Had Vienna fallen, the political consequences might have reshaped the balance of power across the region. Instead, the frontier between the Ottoman and Habsburg worlds continued to harden over the following decades. The struggle for Hungary would continue. Wars between the 2 powers would continue. Neither side emerged from 1529 with complete dominance. That point is important because later generations sometimes portray the siege as a decisive turning point that permanently halted Ottoman expansion. History is rarely that simple. The Ottoman Empire remained powerful long after 1529. Suleiman remained one of the most successful rulers of the 16th century. Ottoman armies continued campaigning across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. The empire had suffered a setback, not a collapse. Historians continue debating some aspects of the campaign. Did Suleiman intend from the beginning to capture Vienna permanently, or was the city a secondary opportunity that emerged during a campaign primarily focused on Hungary? How large was the Ottoman army? Exactly how decisive were weather and logistics compared to military resistance? Reasonable scholars have reached different conclusions on these questions. What most agree upon, however, is that Vienna exposed the growing difficulty of projecting power so far from Ottoman centers of supply. The campaign offered lessons that remain recognizable even today. Commanders must align ambition with logistics. Political objectives must match available resources. Time can become an enemy. Weather can become a combatant. A successful defense does not always require destroying an opposing army. Sometimes survival itself changes the outcome. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the siege is that no single dramatic battlefield maneuver decided it. There was no great cavalry charge that shattered an army. No famous ambush that suddenly reversed the campaign. No decisive field battle that settled the issue in a single afternoon. Instead, Vienna survived through accumulation. One repaired wall, one successful countermine, one failed assault, one more day of resistance. Then another, and another. Eventually, the campaign itself began to unravel. The army outside the walls remained powerful. The city inside the walls remained vulnerable. But time increasingly favored one side over the other. In the end, that proved enough. Centuries later, visitors walking through Vienna can still encounter reminders of the siege that tested the city in 1529. The walls have changed. The empire that sent Suleiman northward has long since disappeared. The political world of the 16th century belongs to history, yet the central lesson remains surprisingly modern. Power is never measured by numbers alone. The First Siege of Vienna reminds us that strategy, logistics, leadership, terrain, weather, and endurance often shape events just as much as armies do. In the autumn of 1529, one of the greatest empires of its age arrived before Vienna with enormous strength and immense confidence. The city did not destroy that empire. It simply endured long enough for the realities of distance, time, and war to do the rest. Centuries later, the story still survives because it reveals a truth that generations of commanders have learned the hard way. Sometimes the most difficult victory is not defeating an enemy, but reaching the battlefield with enough strength left to win.